Hello there. Tonight, I'm going to take you on a journey through dynasties where we will discover lost cities and step inside the minds of those who believed they could live forever. We will visit ancient Egypt, tales of gods and pharaohs, pyramids that pierce the sky, and secrets buried beneath the sands for thousands of years. This isn't just ancient history. This is the oldest civilization that refused to die. If you enjoyed tonight's story, I'd really appreciate it if you could give it a like, subscribe, or maybe comment on where you are listening from. Now sit back, relax, close your eyes, and together we will begin our journey. From the rise of a kingdom along the banks of the Nile, to the reign of god kings and queens who ruled with divine authority, from brutal wars, golden empires, and spiritual revolutions, to the fall to Persia, the rise of Cleopatra, and the final breath under Rome. Egypt endured it all for over 3,000 years. Pharaohs, temples, gods, battles, magic, mystery, madness. This is the story of a civilization that didn't just shape history, it tried to outlast time itself. The story of ancient Egypt begins not with a man or a woman, nor a battle or a city, but with a river. The Nile was the axis on which Egypt turned, a lifeline in a sea of dust. Each year it rose and fell. Each year it spilled over its banks, coating the land with a dark, rich silt that made the desert bloom. This cycle, ancient even before the pharaohs, taught Egypt its rhythm, of time, of harvest, of rebirth. Thousands of years before pyramids etched the skyline or gold gleamed in the tombs of kings, people settled along this river. At first, they were hunters and gatherers, barely clinging to life. By 5000 BCE, they were farming barley and emmer wheat, and raising cattle. Potters shaped vessels by hand. Weavers spun flax into linen. Burials grew more careful, suggesting a belief in an afterlife. Already, the Nile's people were imagining that death was not the end, but a crossing, like sailing downstream into a new world. Cultures rose in the Nile Valley, the Badarian. They made finer tools, brighter pottery, and more ornate graves. They traded far, ivory from Nubia, obsidian from Ethiopia, lapis from Afghanistan. They painted boats and animals, gods and men, even battles, suggesting the first sparks of war over land and control. As villages grew into towns, rival centers of power emerged. In the north lay Lower Egypt, a swampy tangle of papyrus, fish-filled canals, and open delta sky. In the south, Upper Egypt cut through cliffs, narrow and hard. The two lands eyed each other warily. By 3200 BCE, Egypt was on the verge of something new. We call it the proto-dynastic period, the time just before kings, when chieftains became warlords and warlords began to style themselves divine. Tombs at Abydos grow massive. Graves once dug in the sand are lined with brick. Names appear: Scorpion, Ka, Irihor, etched in symbols that would become the first true writing system in Africa. Hieroglyphs. The unification of Egypt is one of the oldest stories we have, and also one of the most mysterious. Did one warlord conquer the rest? Did cities fall in quick succession, or did they slowly weave themselves into one cloth? The names are half lost, but one endures: Nama. His palette, carved in green schist and found at the temple of Hierakonpolis, shows him towering above an enemy, mace raised, wearing both crowns, the white of Upper Egypt and the red of Lower Egypt. On the reverse, mythic beasts intertwine, and Nama surveys rows of headless bodies. Whether Nama and Menes were the same man or not, around 3100 BCE, the two lands became one. This was not just a military act, it was cosmic. Egyptians believed their land had been born from chaos, tamed by the gods. The unification was a reenactment of that first divine order. The king, now Pharaoh, was no mere mortal. He was Horus in the flesh, the god king, keeper of Ma'at, harmony, balance, truth. The new capital, Memphis, was built on the border between the two lands, a living symbol of unity. There the pharaoh could watch over both delta and valley, over grain harvests and desert mines, cattle herds and copper shipments. A bureaucracy rose. Officials recorded grain stores on clay tablets, priests built shrines, and craftsmen sculpted the first royal statues, stiff, idealized, eternal. Religion permeated everything. The Nile did not flood. It was weeping joyfully from the god Hapi. The sun did not simply rise. It sailed across the sky in the bark of Ra, only to fight serpents in the underworld and be reborn each dawn. Every element had a story. Every temple was the world in miniature, with sacred pylons as the horizon, columns as the marsh reeds of creation. Even in these early days, the Egyptians began to dream of eternity. They believed the soul had multiple parts: Ka, the life force; Ba, the personality; and Ak, the radiant spirit. For all three to survive, the body had to be preserved, and the name had to be remembered. This need gave birth to mummification and monuments. The first kings of the early dynastic period, ruling from 3100 to about 2700 BCE, left their names in tombs at Abydos and Saqqara. These tombs, called mastabas, flat-roofed benches of mud brick, were the prototypes of greater things to come. One king, Jer, was buried with retainers sacrificed to serve him in the afterlife. Another, Den, had sandals so finely made they were preserved for 5,000 years. A stone called the Palermo stone records floods, festivals and tax counts. It shows us that even early kings held tight control of the land, measuring harvests, inspecting canals, and rewarding loyalty with gold. Justice was delivered by decree. Offences were punished harshly, but in line with Ma'at. The pharaoh was the axis. His job was not to rule for himself, but to hold the balance. Yet this balance was fragile. Tombs grow ever grander. Royal names swell with divine titles. Bureaucracy stiffens. The belief in divine kingship deepens. But so does the fear of what happens if the king fails. Drought, famine, chaos. These weren't seen as misfortune, but as signs that Ma'at had been broken, that the pharaoh had failed. Still, the dream endured. By the end of this early age, Egypt had a calendar, a priesthood, a pantheon of gods: Isis, Osiris, Thoth, Anubis, each with temples, myths, and sacred animals. The duality of Egypt, life and death, desert and flood, order and chaos, became not a contradiction, but the key to understanding the world. Everything was preparing for something immense. The next dynasty would not just build tombs, it would build mountains. Pharaohs would not only rule as gods on earth, they would reach for the stars themselves. The river flowed on, the stars turned, the people watched, and somewhere on the edge of the desert, plans were drawn up for a staircase to eternity. If Egypt was born beside the Nile, it came of age beneath the shadow of stone. Around 2700 BCE, a new line of rulers took the throne, ambitious, confident, and eager to show that they were not just kings of men, but anchors of the universe. This era, known today as the Old Kingdom, would last 5 centuries and change the world forever. It gave us the Great Pyramids, the Sphinx, and the firm belief that a ruler could live forever, if only the tomb was big enough. The architect of this vision, literally, was a man named Imhotep, vizier to Pharaoh Djoser of the Third Dynasty. More than an administrator, Imhotep was a priest, doctor, astronomer, and master builder. Djoser charged him with constructing a tomb that would outshine all others. At Saqqara, Imhotep built not just a tomb but a revolution, a six-stepped pyramid, stacked mastabas of stone, rising in tiers to the sky. The step pyramid was unlike anything the world had seen. Surrounding it was a vast complex of courtyards, temples, and ceremonial buildings. Columns carved to look like bundled reeds evoked the marshes of creation. Stone, no longer mud brick, was now the chosen material. Egypt had entered the age of permanence. With each generation, ambition soared higher. Sneferu, founder of the Fourth Dynasty, built not one but 3 pyramids, refining the shape, the slope, the method. At Meidum, the structure collapsed. At Dashur, the bent pyramid changed angle midway up, revealing lessons in engineering learned the hard way. Finally, the Red Pyramid, sleek, smooth-sided, stood as the prototype for all that followed. But it was Sneferu's son, Khufu, who would raise Egypt's greatest monument. Around 2580 BCE, on the Giza Plateau just outside Memphis, Khufu ordered the construction of a pyramid so massive it would remain the tallest human-made structure on Earth for over 3,800 years. The Great Pyramid, originally 146 meters high, used over 2 million limestone blocks, some weighing 70 tons. No one knows the exact method of construction. Ramps, levers, human chains. Theories abound, but what matters is that it worked. Every stone was set with care. Every angle aligned to the stars. The base is almost perfectly square, the sides nearly aligned with the cardinal points of the compass. This was not just architecture, it was theology made solid. To the Egyptians, the pyramid was a machine of resurrection. Its shape echoed the sun's rays. Its inner passages were ladders for the soul to ascend. The pyramid texts, inscribed on the inner walls of later tombs, chant spells and invocations, to protect the pharaoh, to feed his car, to guide him to the sky, where he would become one with the stars. An Akh, a shining spirit. Beside Khufu's pyramid stood others. His son Khafra, whose complex included the Great Sphinx, and Menkaure, whose smaller pyramid was clad in red granite. The Giza Plateau became a necropolis, a city of the dead for a king and his court. But this was not a land of slaves. Contrary to myth, the pyramids were not built by chained laborers. Nearby workers' villages show well-fed laborers, skilled craftsmen, and evidence of medical care. This was a national effort, mobilized during the Nile's annual flood, when fields lay underwater. Food, beer, and linen were delivered as taxes. In return, workers got meals, housing, and a place in eternity, because to labor for the pharaoh was to participate in the divine. While the pyramids rose, the state matured. Pharaohs ruled as divine lawgivers, but they could not govern alone. A hierarchy emerged. Viziers at the top, then provincial governors known as nomarchs, then scribes, the backbone of bureaucracy. They recorded everything: crops, taxes, cattle, prayers. Hieroglyphs now filled tomb walls, stelae, statues. Time was carved in stone. Religion too deepened. The gods proliferated. In addition to Ra, the sun god, new deities gained prominence. Hathor, cow-headed goddess of joy. Ptah, the craftsman. Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe of the gods. Temples grew in wealth and power. Priests interpreted omens and managed estates. Life revolved around Ma'at, the divine balance. To sin was not just to do wrong, it was to create disorder. The Old Kingdom was an age of confidence. Art was idealized, serene. Statues of scribes, even in middle age and pot-bellied, sat alert and dignified. Paintings showed daily life, baking bread, rowing boats, netting fish, vibrant, organized, eternal. Yet behind the grandeur, problems stirred. As pyramids grew larger, so did the cost. Entire economies were funneled into stone. Local governors, far from Memphis, began to act as petty kings. Their tombs, rock-cut mastabas in places like Beni Hassan, rivaled the royal ones. They taxed their own regions, raised militias, and carved their names in hieroglyphs as proudly as any pharaoh. Under the later kings, Unas, Teti, Pepi I, royal power began to slip. Records of grain shipments show corruption and shortfalls. Nile floods were lower. Famines crept in. The pharaoh, once a living god, was now seen as one among many lords. Even his afterlife texts were now shared with nobles, a democratization of eternity. The last great ruler of the Old Kingdom was Pepi II, who may have ruled over 90 years, but by the time he died, around 2180 BCE, the central state had withered. Provinces broke away. Tombs went unbuilt. Grain ran out. The scribes stopped recording. And so came the first intermediate period, a time when the great machine of Ma'at faltered. The land, once unified from the delta to Nubia, splintered into a mosaic of petty kingdoms. Bandits ruled the roads. Tombs were robbed. Temples fell into disrepair. Yet Egypt did not fall into silence. Local kings still honored the gods, wrote their names in cartouches, and ruled as best they could. Art continued, rougher, more expressive. A new realism crept into texts. One scribe wrote a lament. Lo, the land turns round as does a potter's wheel. The robber is now the rich man. Men are few. The dead are thrown into the river. These were dark years, but not the end. For Egypt had already built something indelible. In stone, in myth, in memory. The pyramids stood firm. The Nile still rose. And in time, new rulers would rise from the south, wearing crowns once thought lost, claiming to restore the old ways. The dream of the two lands was not dead, only sleeping. Egypt would rise again, wiser and warier, and the next kingdom would rule not by stone alone, but by strategy, diplomacy, and divine renewal. Chaos and rebirth, the Middle Kingdom. When the great stone pyramids faded into shadow and the royal court fractured into regional strongholds, it seemed as though Egypt's long golden age had ended. For more than a century after the death of Pepi II, Egypt fragmented. The central government collapsed. Local rulers, nomarchs, took over their districts, raising their own armies, collecting their own taxes. The Nile still rose. Crops were still planted. But there was no unifying voice, no divine king to hold the balance of the two lands. Egypt, for the first time in centuries, was adrift. This was the first intermediate period, a time remembered later as one of darkness and disarray. But like all Egyptian eras, it was more complex than it first appears. Far from the royal court in Memphis, local dynasties thrived. In Heracleopolis, a powerful family ruled the north, while in the south, a rival house emerged in Thebes, a provincial town that would soon transform into the heart of a reborn Egypt. The southern rulers began calling themselves kings. One of them, Mentuhotep II, brought vision and military skill. Around 2040 BCE, after years of civil war, he marched north, defeated the Heracleopolitan rulers, and reunified Egypt. He wore the two crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. He restored Ma'at, and he ushered in the Middle Kingdom. This was Egypt's second great age, less obsessed with colossal monuments, more concerned with wisdom, stability, and reform. The pyramids had not saved the old kingdom. The people had suffered. Now, the new rulers would focus not just on eternity, but on the land itself. Mentuhotep II built a unique mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahri, set into a sheer cliff across from Thebes. It blended architecture and landscape, a fusion of power and piety. Around him, temples were restored, tombs repainted, canals dredged. Egypt, once cracked and parched, began to breathe again. The new rulers were not divine in the same remote sense as their predecessors. They were shepherds, caretakers of a wounded land. This shift is visible in their art and writing. Statues of kings like Senusret III show furrowed brows, downturned lips, eyes heavy with care. The pharaoh, once a youthful god, was now a seasoned man of burdens. Senusret III, one of the Middle Kingdom's greatest kings, ruled with steel and vision. He reined in the power of the nomarchs, replacing them with appointed governors loyal to the throne. He reasserted control over Nubia, building fortresses like those at Semna and Buin, and extended Egypt's influence as far as the Second Cataract. His officers recorded everything from troop movements to trade inventories, on ostraca and papyrus, now invaluable to historians. Egypt's reach extended abroad too. Trade blossomed. Ships sailed south to Punt, land of incense and gold. Expeditions to Sinai mined turquoise and copper. Craftsmanship improved. Jewelry sparkled with carnelian, faience, and lapis lazuli. Literature flourished. For the first time, we hear not just prayers or royal boasts, but introspection. Texts like the tale of the shipwrecked sailor or the instructions of a Menemhat reflect new values: cleverness, resilience, personal virtue. In one famous tale, Sinuhe, a courtier flees Egypt after the king's death, wanders in exile, and finally returns older, wiser, to be buried at home. It's a deeply human story, echoing a kingdom that had wandered through chaos and found its way back. This was the hallmark of the Middle Kingdom: realism and responsibility. Gone were the grand pyramids. Instead, kings were buried in more modest complexes, often near El-Lisht or Dashur, guarded by modest pyramids made with mud brick cores. Some have crumbled to ruin, but their memories endure in inscriptions. Religion, too, was shifting. Though Ra, the sun god, remained dominant, a quieter, more personal deity began rising in influence. Osiris, lord of the dead. Once a local god of Abydos, Osiris had become the symbol of death, resurrection, and moral judgment. Now, even commoners believed they could join him in the afterlife, if they lived with integrity and their hearts balanced against the feather of Ma'at. Tombs of the elite show this new religious hope. Scenes of banquets, music, and daily work suggest not just a paradise, but a reward for a life well lived. The Book of the Dead, still evolving, would later codify these beliefs. For now, the path to eternity was opening beyond royalty. Despite its strength, the Middle Kingdom was not invincible. By the 13th dynasty, central power weakened again. Kings came and went quickly. Records grow thin. Authority slipped. In the north, a foreign group of rulers, Semitic in origin, established themselves in the delta. Known later as the Hyksos, they brought new tools of war: horse-drawn chariots, composite bows, and bronze weapons. These newcomers, based at Avaris, did not sack Egypt, they integrated. They ruled as pharaohs, worshipped Egyptian gods, and adopted hieroglyphs. But to the Thebans in the south, their presence was an insult. Foreigners on the throne broke my heart, and slowly resistance gathered. One local ruler, Sekenenre Tao, died violently in battle, his skull later found riddled with axe wounds. His son, Kamose, took the fight further, pushing north, attacking Hyksos outposts, and then his brother, Ahmose I, finished the job. Around 1550 BCE, he stormed Avaris, expelled the Hyksos, and reclaimed the delta. Egypt was once again united, stronger, wiser, and bristling with new military power. The Middle Kingdom had ended, but it had left a powerful legacy, a reformed state, a broadened worldview, and a belief that wisdom, not just monuments, was the key to eternity. And now, with its enemies cast out and its borders restored, Egypt stood on the brink of its greatest glory. The new kingdom was dawning, and with it would come warriors, empire, and the most famous names in all of Egyptian history. Empire of Gold. The new kingdom begins. Egypt had weathered famine, civil war, and foreign occupation. But in the ashes of the Hyksos defeat, something changed. The trauma of occupation left a deep scar and a resolve. No longer would Egypt wait for invaders to come. It would go to them first. With its enemies driven out, its armies reorganized, and its gods seemingly vindicated, Egypt entered a new phase. The new kingdom, circa 1550 to 1070 BCE. This would be Egypt's golden age, a time of warrior pharaohs, imperial conquest, global trade, and monumental splendor. The man who launched this age was Ahmose I. Having expelled the Hyksos and reclaimed the delta, he rebuilt Egypt's heart. He reopened quarries, restored temples, and re-established central power from the Mediterranean to Nubia. He also reshaped the army. Chariots, once a foreign weapon, were now Egyptian standards: light, fast, deadly. Bronze-tipped spears, body armor, and professional standing troops became the new norm. Ahmose's successors, including Amenhotep I and Thutmose I, continued the work of consolidation and expansion. For the first time in history, Egypt went fully imperial. Campaigns marched into Canaan and Syria, while in the south, Nubia was subdued with brutal efficiency. Fortresses lined the Nile. Tribute poured in: gold, cattle, ebony, exotic animals, and enslaved captives. Egypt had become not just a kingdom, but an empire. It was under Thutmose III, however, that Egypt reached its greatest territorial extent. Often called the Napoleon of Egypt, Thutmose came to power as a child, with his stepmother Hatshepsut acting as regent, and then as pharaoh herself. When he finally assumed sole control, Thutmose III launched over 17 military campaigns into the Levant and beyond. At Megiddo, he besieged a coalition of rebellious city-states, waited 7 months, and then marched triumphantly into the captured fortress. The spoils were enormous: weapons, horses, armor, tribute, and hostages to guarantee loyalty. By the end of his reign, Egypt's influence reached from the Euphrates River in modern Iraq to the Fourth Cataract in Nubia. But this was not a conquest of destruction. It was a conquest of connection. Egypt spread its language, religion, and aesthetics. Foreign princes were brought to court, raised in Egyptian ways, and sent back as loyal vassals. In return, Egypt received wood from Lebanon, silver from Anatolia, incense from Punt, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Yet Egypt's most radical ruler during this time did not march with armies, but with ideas. Hatshepsut, the daughter of Thutmose I, ruled first as regent for her young stepson, but eventually crowned herself pharaoh. In a culture where women rarely ruled alone, she carved out a unique space. She styled herself with the false beard of kings, depicted herself in male form, and ruled for over 2 decades. Her reign was peaceful and prosperous. She sent expeditions to Punt, an exotic land of incense, myrrh, and gold. At Deir el-Bahri, she built a mortuary temple of dazzling elegance. Terraces, colonnades, and sacred reliefs showing gods and trees brought back from foreign shores. She restored temples, encouraged trade, and left Egypt richer than she found it. After her death, Thutmose III reclaimed the throne and tried to erase her memory, chipping her name off monuments, defacing statues. Perhaps it was vengeance, or perhaps it was fear of setting precedent. A woman who had ruled too well. Egypt's religion remained vibrant and vast, but it was about to undergo a shock. Under Amenhotep III, Egypt basked in diplomatic glory. His letters, discovered at Amarna, show correspondence with Babylon, Assyria, and Mycenaean Greece. Gifts flowed, golden thrones, daughters offered in marriage, messages carved in Akkadian. Egypt was now a superpower in a world of kings. But his son, Amenhotep IV, later known as Akhenaten, rejected that world. He moved the capital from Thebes to a barren stretch of desert, built a new city called Akhetaten, modern Amarna, and declared the sun disk, Aten the only true God. He closed temples to Amun, dismissed priests, and changed his name to reflect devotion to his solar god. It was the world's first known attempt at monotheism. Art changed too. Akhenaten was shown with elongated features, wide hips, soft stomach, embracing his family under rays of Aten's light. Gone were the rigid poses of the past. In their place, intimacy, motion, even tenderness. But while the capital turned inward, Egypt's empire frayed. Allies were attacked. Provinces rebelled. Letters from Canaan begged for help. "Why do you not come?" they asked. But no army came. After Akhenaten's death, his fragile order collapsed. His successor, perhaps a son-in-law, was a boy, Tutankhaten, who quickly changed his name to Tutankhamun and moved the capital back to Thebes. The temples of Amun reopened. The gods returned. The memory of Akhenaten was condemned, his city abandoned, his name struck from records. Tutankhamun died young, around 18 or 19. His reign was brief, but his tomb, discovered in 1922, would become the most famous in the world. Packed with treasures, it offered a glimpse into the splendor of New Kingdom burial. Gold masks, chariots, thrones, amulets, and games, all untouched for over 3,000 years. Tutankhamun was succeeded by Ai, then by Horemheb, a military man who tried to restore normalcy. Then came the 19th dynasty, and with it, Egypt's last great line of pharaohs. Seti I was a builder and general. His son, Ramesses II, known as Ramesses the Great, would become a legend. Ramesses II reigned for over 66 years, longer than any pharaoh before or after. He fought the Hittites at Kadesh in one of the world's earliest recorded battles. Though the battle was likely a draw, Ramesses proclaimed victory with enormous reliefs showing him alone in a chariot, slaying hundreds. He later signed one of the first peace treaties in history. Ramesses built on a scale not seen since the Old Kingdom. He raised temples at Luxor, added to Karnak, and carved his own complex at Abu Simbel, its statue standing 20 meters tall. In Pi Ramesses, he created a new capital of gleaming stone and bustling life. Statues of himself stood everywhere. He ruled so long that by the time he died, aged around 90, people assumed pharaohs simply lived forever. But time catches all empires. After Ramesses, Egypt struggled. Foreign powers grew stronger. The sea peoples attacked, causing chaos across the Mediterranean. Ramesses III repelled them, but at great cost. Economic troubles and corruption crept in. Workers at Deir el-Medina, who built the royal tombs, staged the first recorded labor strike in history, protesting unpaid wages. By the end of the New Kingdom, royal authority weakened. High priests of Amun began ruling Thebes like kings. In the north, generals controlled the delta. Tombs were looted. Foreigners settled. The age of empire was ending. Still, the New Kingdom left behind a legacy of awe. Its temples rose like mountains. Its art glowed with life. Its names, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, echo still. Egypt had ruled not just its own land, but shaped the world around it. It had reached the summit. Now, the long descent would begin. Divided kingdoms and foreign kings. The third intermediate period. The sun that had once blazed over Egypt's golden age now hung lower in the sky. The power of the pharaoh, once absolute and divine, had begun to fracture. After the long reigns of Ramesses II and Ramesses III, Egypt no longer held the balance of the world. It had exhausted its empire, stretched its wealth, and fed its gods until the treasury ran dry. Now the once unified two lands began to split again, between priests and warlords, between north and south, between memory and reality. This age, known to historians as the Third Intermediate Period circa 1070 to 664 BCE, was a time of division, foreign influence, and unexpected resilience. Egypt was no longer a superpower, but it was far from finished. The final Ramesside pharaoh, Ramesses XI, ruled in name, but not in control. By the end of his reign, around 1070 BCE, Egypt had already cracked into two main spheres. In the south, Thebes was dominated by the high priests of Amun, a dynasty of spiritual rulers who held military power, taxed land, and buried kings in secret to stop looting. These priests claimed to preserve Maat, but they effectively ruled like kings. Many even adopted royal titles. In the north, power fell to Smendes, a general based in Tanis in the Nile Delta. He founded the 21st dynasty and ruled the north while acknowledging the priests in Thebes. Egypt now functioned as two realms, linked by culture, religion, and ritual, but politically severed. The tomb builders of Deir el-Medina were disbanded. The Valley of the Kings, once the eternal resting place of pharaohs, lay abandoned. Many royal tombs were broken into, some by robbers, others by officials trying to hide or preserve the remains. In one cave near Deir el-Bahri, dozens of mummies, including those of Thutmose III, Seti I, and Ramesses II, were found centuries later, hastily rewrapped and hidden away. The 22nd dynasty brought a new twist. Libyan rule. Descendants of foreign mercenaries who had served the pharaohs during the New Kingdom rose to power in the Delta. Shoshenq, originally a Libyan military leader, seized control around 945 BCE. He strengthened Egypt's grip on the north, campaigned into Canaan, and may even be the biblical Shishak, who plundered Jerusalem during the time of Solomon's son, Rehoboam. Shoshenq's reign marked a brief revival. His name was carved in Karnak, his exploits recorded on temple walls. But unity didn't last. After his death, rival branches of his family carved up Egypt into increasingly smaller territories. Egypt was a map of power centers. Tanis, Bubastis, Leontopolis, and Heracleopolis in the north, Thebes and Nubia in the south. Each had its own king, its own court, and its own ambitions. Into this chaos came a surprising power from the far south. Kush. The Nubians, long under Egyptian influence, had built their own kingdom at Napata, embracing Egyptian gods, writing, and customs. They worshipped Amun with a zeal that even rivaled Thebes. And now they saw themselves not as outsiders, but as the rightful restorers of Egypt's lost greatness. Around 750 BCE, a Nubian king named Pianki, or Pie, launched a bold campaign. His inscriptions, grand, poetic, and full of divine destiny, tell of a mission not of conquest, but of purification. He defeated the petty kings of northern Egypt, demanded submission, and entered Thebes as a religious savior. He bowed before Amun, purified the temples, and inscribed his victories on a granite stele as both ruler and believer. Pianki returned to Nubia, leaving Egypt under his dynasty's control. His successors, Shabaka, Taharqa, and Tanutamani, formed the 25th dynasty, known today as the Kushite or Nubian pharaohs. Their rule brought a return to Old Kingdom ideals. Building programs flourished, temples were expanded, and pyramids rose again, this time in Nubia, at sites like El Kuru and Nuri. Their art echoed classical forms, and their faith in Amun burned bright. But the world around Egypt had changed. To the northeast, a new power was rising. Assyria, brutal and unrelenting. The Assyrians had already swept through Mesopotamia and Syria. Now they looked to Egypt. In 671 BCE, Assyrian king Esarhaddon invaded. The Nubian pharaoh Taharqa tried to resist, but the Assyrian army, armed with iron weapons, siege towers, and war chariots, was unstoppable. Memphis fell. Royal family members were captured and paraded. Though Taharqa would briefly return, Egypt was no longer safe from foreign domination. The final blow came in 663 BCE, when Esarhaddon's son, Ashurbanipal, invaded again. Thebes was sacked, its temples looted, its libraries plundered. Though Egyptian culture survived, its independence now hung by a thread. Yet from the wreckage rose a man determined to revive Egypt on his own terms. His name was Psamtik I, a local prince from Sais in the western delta. Backed by Greek mercenaries and clever diplomacy, Psamtik unified the land and expelled foreign garrisons. Around 664 BCE, he founded the 26th dynasty, a renaissance rooted in nostalgia and national pride. Psamtik and his descendants re-embraced the forms of the past. They revived Old Kingdom art styles, imitated the inscriptions of ancient kings, and called themselves restorers of the true ways. Temples were repaired, scribes recopied lost texts. Egypt looked inward, but also outward. Psamtik opened the country to trade with the Greeks, who now began settling at Naucratis, Egypt's first Greek colony. For a moment, Egypt had found a new breath. Ancient in spirit, cosmopolitan in fact, but the world was closing in. Beyond the desert, a new empire stirred. Persia, vast and hungry. Conquered, but not broken. The Persian conquest and the last pharaohs. Egypt had outlasted famine, civil war, and even occupation. Through centuries of chaos, its heart had kept beating. But in the 6th century BCE, a new force emerged beyond the eastern deserts. One too large, too fast, and too organized to ignore. This was the Persian Empire, and soon it would become the largest the world had ever seen. Under Psamtik I and the rulers of the 26th dynasty, Egypt had achieved a revival. From their capital at Sais, These site kings reasserted control from the delta to the first cataract. They built in the old style, commissioned colossal statues, and patronized scribes and priests who copied ancient texts line by line. Egypt, they believed, could recover its greatness by reviving its past. Trade flourished. The city of Naucratis became a thriving port of Greek merchants. The Egyptians watched curiously as these newcomers brought their own gods, their own scripts, and silver coinage. Some Greeks, like Herodotus, who later visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, were captivated, calling Egypt the gift of the Nile. Others joined the army as mercenaries. Yet even as Egypt looked backward with pride, the world moved forward. In 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon, swallowing the remnants of Mesopotamia. Egypt stood alone, surrounded by empires. In 525 BCE, Cyrus's son, Cambyses II, marched west. The Persian army, crossing the Sinai, clashed with Egyptian forces near Pelusium, a delta fortress. According to legend, the Persians carried images of the sacred Egyptian cat before them, knowing their enemies would hesitate to fire. The Egyptians were routed. Memphis fell. The last native pharaoh of the Site line, Psamtik III, was captured. Egypt was now a province of a foreign empire, satrapy number 6 of the Achaemenid Persian state. But unlike earlier invaders, the Persians did not seek to erase Egypt. They adopted its titles. Cambyses presented himself as pharaoh, performed rituals in the temples, and respected the gods, at least at first. Later sources, especially Greek ones, paint Cambyses as a madman who stabbed the Apis bull, looted temples, and mocked the priests. But Persian records tell a different story, of careful diplomacy and temple endowments. The truth may lie somewhere between. Resentment flared under a foreign king, but Egyptian life went on. For nearly 200 years, Egypt would fall in and out of Persian control. Periods of resistance sparked and failed. One rare flame of independence came under Amyrtaeus, a rebel from the marshes of the Delta, who seized power around 404 BCE and ruled briefly as the only king of the 28th dynasty. Later, under the 29th and 30th dynasties, Egypt saw one final burst of native rule. Kings like Nectanebo I and Nectanebo II tried to revive the old spirit. They built temples across the land at Philae, Karnak and Dendera, and invested heavily in ritual and defense. Greek mercenaries bolstered their forces, and coins bearing Egyptian symbols were minted in both bronze and gold. But this was the last stand. In 343 BCE, the Persians returned. Artaxerxes III crushed the native resistance, tore down walls, and stripped temples of gold. Nectanebo II, Egypt's last native-born pharaoh, fled to Nubia. His dynasty ended in exile, and with it, 3,000 years of native Egyptian rule. Still, the Nile did not forget its past. The temples stood, the rituals endured. Even as foreign kings ruled from afar, they still bowed to Amun and carved their names in cartouches. Egypt had become a jewel of empires, desired, conquered, and preserved. And then, into this ancient world, stepped a man not from Persia, but from Macedonia. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great marched into Egypt. The Persians had lost favor, and the Egyptians welcomed Alexander as a liberator. At Memphis, he was crowned as a native pharaoh. He journeyed to the oracle of Amun at Siwa, deep in the western desert, and was declared the son of a god. Alexander did not stay long. His ambitions lay to the east, in Persia and beyond. But he left a mark. Near the Mediterranean coast, he ordered the founding of a new city, Alexandria. It would become Egypt's new capital and one of the greatest cities in the ancient world. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his empire fractured. Egypt fell to one of his generals, Ptolemy, who took the title of satrap and later pharaoh. Thus began the Ptolemaic dynasty, foreign in blood but Egyptian in image. Ptolemy and his descendants ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years. They adopted Egyptian customs, dressed as pharaohs in reliefs, and built temples to Isis and Horus alongside Greek-style theatres and libraries. The most famous of them, Ptolemy I Soter, founded the Library of Alexandria, a beacon of learning for centuries. Yet theirs was a kingdom of contradiction. Greek rulers governed a largely Egyptian population. Temples thrived, but the court spoke Greek. Egyptian priests were honored, but Greek elites controlled politics. Tensions simmered beneath the marble and gold. The last and most famous ruler of this dynasty was Cleopatra VII, a woman of brilliance, diplomacy, and tragedy. Fluent in Egyptian, Greek, and several other languages, Cleopatra presented herself not only as queen, but as Isis reborn. She formed alliances with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony to keep Egypt free from Roman control. But Rome could not be stopped. In 30 BCE, after the defeat at the Battle of Actium, Cleopatra and Antony took their own lives. Egypt became a Roman province, ruled from afar by emperors who now wore the legacy of pharaohs like a borrowed robe. And yet, even under Rome, Egypt remained Egypt. The temples still rang with prayers to Isis. The Nile still flooded. The priests still walked in white linen, reading stars, intoning the old hymns. Mummification continued, even as Latin words crept into daily life. It would take centuries more. Christianity, the closing of the temples, and finally the Arab conquest in 641 CE, for the ancient Egyptian religion to fade from practice. But its memory never died. Egypt had been conquered, ruled by Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans. Yet its culture endured. Its gods survived. Its symbols, ankhs, scarabs, hieroglyphs, outlived its kings. This was not just a land of kings. It was a civilization of astonishing continuity. Through sandstorms and empires, it kept breathing. And as the final pharaohs passed into myth, the Nile kept flowing, carrying their stories into eternity. The Greek pharaohs, Ptolemaic Egypt, and Cleopatra. By the time Alexander the Great set foot on Egyptian soil in 332 BCE, Egypt was weary of Persian rule. The invaders from the east had pillaged temples, disrespected local customs, and treated the ancient land as just another province in their sprawling empire. When Alexander entered Memphis, the Egyptians welcomed him as a liberator. He did not disappoint them. He honored the gods, offered sacrifices to Apis, and traveled deep into the western desert to the Siwa oasis, where the oracle of Amun-Ra reportedly hailed him as a divine son. That was enough. To the Egyptians, Alexander was now a legitimate pharaoh, blessed by Amun, chosen by fate. He stayed in Egypt only a few months, but he left behind a legacy that would shape its future. On a wind-blown stretch of coast between the Nile Delta and the Mediterranean, he ordered the construction of a new city, Alexandria. Designed by Greek architects, gridded with straight streets and monumental boulevards, it would soon become the intellectual and cultural heart of the Mediterranean world. Temples rose beside gymnasia. Egyptian shrines stood within sight of Greek theatres. This was Egypt, but with a new accent. When Alexander died suddenly in Babylon in 323 BCE, his empire fractured into rival kingdoms. Egypt fell to Ptolemy, one of his most trusted generals. A clever, pragmatic man, Ptolemy quickly declared himself satrap, and later, in 305 BCE, Ptolemy I, Soter, savior, pharaoh of Egypt. Thus began the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek family ruling the most Egyptian of lands for nearly 300 years. To the outside world, this was an odd arrangement. Greek rulers speaking Greek, worshipping Greek gods, yet draped in Egyptian linen, depicted in temple reliefs as pharaohs making offerings to Horus, Thoth, and Isis. It was a political balancing act. In public temples, the Ptolemies posed as traditional monarchs. In private, they lived like Hellenistic kings, hosting lavish symposia, promoting Greek philosophers, and commissioning marble statues in the style of Athens. But they understood Egypt's heart. Ptolemy, I began a policy that defined the dynasty: respect the past, embrace its grandeur, and use it to legitimize their rule. He patronized temples, restored crumbling shrines, and started the construction of massive complexes like the Temple of Horus at Edfu and Dendera's grand structure dedicated to Hathor. Greek rulers, Egyptian gods, two systems, one throne. Alexandria flourished. By the 3rd century BCE, it rivaled Athens and Babylon as a center of knowledge. The Library of Alexandria, established by Ptolemy I and expanded by his successors, aimed to collect every book in the known world. Papyrus scrolls from India, Greece, Egypt, and Mesopotamia filled its shelves. At its height, it may have held over 400,000 scrolls, medical texts, poetry, science, history, all under one roof. Nearby stood the Mausion, a scholarly community where thinkers like Euclid, father of geometry, Eratosthenes, who calculated Earth's circumference, and Hero of Alexandria, who invented early steam-powered devices, studied and taught. Knowledge was currency, and Alexandria was rich. The Ptolemies ruled well in their early generations. Ptolemy II Philadelphus expanded trade, welcomed Jews, Persians, and Greeks alike, and began the construction of the Lighthouse of Alexandria, a 100-meter marvel that became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But as time wore on, the dynasty turned inward. The later Ptolemies were notorious for court intrigue, incest, and instability. Brothers married sisters, fathers fought sons. Assassinations and poisonings became common. The crown passed not through military victory or noble birth, but through scheming, flattery, and foreign alliances. Meanwhile, in the wider world, Rome was rising. What began as a republic on the Tiber had become a Mediterranean superpower. Rome's legions swept across Greece and the eastern Mediterranean. By the 2nd century BCE, Egypt's independence was more illusion than fact. The Ptolemies survived because Rome allowed them to. Into this fading dynasty was born its last and most famous ruler, Cleopatra VII. She came to power in 51 BCE at just 18 years old, sharing the throne with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, whom she was forced to marry. But Cleopatra was no ordinary ruler. Unlike her recent ancestors, she spoke Egyptian fluently, embraced native customs, and presented herself not only as a Hellenistic queen, but as Isis incarnate. Cleopatra was brilliant, multilingual, charismatic, and ruthlessly strategic. Forced into exile after a palace coup, she returned to power by aligning herself with the one man who could change her fate, Julius Caesar. In 48 BCE, after Caesar arrived in pursuit of his rival Pompey, Cleopatra famously had herself smuggled into the palace, possibly inside a rug or linen sack, and won Caesar's favor. Together, they crushed her brother's forces, restored Cleopatra to the throne, and had a child, Ptolemy 15, nicknamed Caesarion, Little Caesar. For a time, Cleopatra ruled as Queen of Egypt and consort to the most powerful man in Rome. But Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE left her vulnerable. She returned to Alexandria, now alone, and faced new Roman chaos, a civil war between Caesar's assassins and his successors. In 41 BCE, Cleopatra aligned with one of those successors, Mark Antony, a Roman general and Caesar's ally. Their partnership, both political and romantic, became legend. They had 3 children. They ruled as king and queen from Alexandria. They imagined a new empire, East and West, Egypt and Rome, united under their house. But Rome would not share power. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, later Augustus, declared war. In 31 BCE, at the Battle of Actium, Cleopatra and Antony's fleet was defeated. The following year, as Octavian approached Alexandria, Antony fell on his sword. Cleopatra, refusing humiliation in a Roman triumph, famously took her own life, by asp or poison, no one knows for sure. Octavian entered Alexandria and annexed Egypt. Caesarion was executed. The Ptolemaic dynasty ended. Egypt, after over 3,000 years of native kings and foreign pharaohs, became a province of Rome. But Cleopatra's legacy endured, mystified, vilified, romanticized. To Egypt, she was the last flame of independence. To Rome, a dangerous seductress. To later generations, a symbol of power, pride, and tragic allure. With Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, the story of the pharaohs ended, but Egypt's story was far from over. Temples still rang with chants to Isis. Priests still walked in white linen, weighing hearts and whispering hymns. And though Rome ruled from afar, Egyptian religion, writing, and ritual continued to echo for centuries. A new chapter had begun. Egypt under the Caesars. Rome on the Nile. Egypt as a Roman province. When Cleopatra died in 30 BCE, Egypt did not die with her. Though she was the last pharaoh in a line that stretched back over 3,000 years, the culture that had birthed pyramids, gods, and hieroglyphs endured, even as Rome claimed the Nile as its own. The conqueror, Octavian, soon to be Augustus, the first Roman emperor, made Egypt unlike any other part of the Roman Empire. It was not a senatorial province governed by a noble of Rome. It was the emperor's private possession. A Roman prefect, handpicked from the equestrian class, below the senatorial elite, would rule it in Augustus's name. This arrangement made it clear Egypt belonged not to the Senate, but to the emperor alone. There were reasons for this special status. Egypt was fabulously wealthy. Its grain, flood-grown, predictable, and abundant, was vital to feeding the growing population of Rome. Control of the Nile's breadbasket gave Augustus not just prestige, but leverage. He guarded it jealously. Senators were banned from entering Egypt without imperial permission. Despite the conquest, the Roman state took a delicate approach. The new rulers understood that Egypt was not just another province. It had a soul of its own, a deep, sacred heritage. Temples were not dismantled, they were maintained. Priests were not cast aside, they were subsidized. Augustus had his name carved in hieroglyphs beside offerings to Amun, Thoth, and Isis, styled like any pharaoh before him. Egyptians, long accustomed to foreign kings, from Hyksos to Persians to Greeks, adjusted to this new arrangement. In the public eye, Roman emperors became pharaohs, though they rarely visited. They were shown in reliefs wearing the double crown, offering incense, smiting enemies. In reality, their rule was distant, but the image, the illusion, was enough. Egyptian religion demanded continuity, and Rome provided it. Temples continued to operate, especially in Upper Egypt. The great sanctuaries at Philae, Dendera, and Kom Ombo remained active. The temple of Isis at Philae, on an island near the First Cataract, became a hub of pilgrimage. There, the rituals of Egypt continued largely unchanged for centuries, even as Christianity rose, even as Latin law spread, even as emperors rose and fell in Rome. Alexandria, meanwhile, became the most cosmopolitan city in the empire outside of Rome itself. It was a city of contradictions, Greek in language, Egyptian in soul, Roman in government. Its famous library had declined by the time of Augustus, likely due to earlier fires during Caesar's campaigns. Still, Alexandria remained a beacon of learning. Mathematicians, philosophers, physicians, and theologians walked its streets. Among them was Claudius Ptolemy, a Greco-Egyptian polymath who lived in Alexandria during the 2nd century CE. His works on astronomy, geography, and optics would dominate scientific thought in Europe and the Islamic world for over 1,000 years. Religion in Roman Egypt was layered and complex. Traditional Egyptian polytheism thrived, but so did imported cults. The mystery religions of Isis and Serapis spread far beyond the Nile. Temples to these gods were built in Rome, Pompeii, Delphi, and even London. The cult of Isis, in particular, found resonance among non-Egyptians. A maternal deity promising salvation, eternal life, and divine love. But change was coming from within. In the 1st century CE, Christianity took root in Egypt. According to tradition, St. Mark brought the faith to Alexandria around 42 CE. At first, it was just another mystery cult in a crowded city of beliefs, but it spread rapidly, especially among the poor and the disenfranchised. By the 3rd century CE, Egypt was one of the most Christianized regions of the empire. Its believers, however, paid a high price. Under emperors like Decius and Diocletian, persecutions erupted. Churches were destroyed. Priests were arrested. Many died. In Alexandria, martyrs were made daily. Still, faith endured. In the deserts beyond the Nile Valley, new communities formed, not cities, but monasteries. The age of the Desert Fathers began. Men like Anthony the Great, who renounced the world, lived in caves, fasted for days, and prayed without ceasing. These hermits and monks became heroes of early Christianity, and their way of life, the monastic movement, would shape Christian practice across continents. By the early 4th century, everything changed. Emperor Constantine, after his victory at the Milvian Bridge, embraced Christianity. In 313 CE, the Edict of Milan legalized the faith. Churches emerged from the shadows. Bishops gained power. And in Alexandria, a new title arose. The Pope of Alexandria, leader of the Egyptian Church, known today as the Coptic Church. But the rise of Christianity brought conflict too. The great temples, once the beating heart of Egypt's religion, now faced erasure. The state turned away from the old gods. Paganism was suppressed, its priests disbanded, its scriptures burned. The last known hieroglyphic inscription, written in the Temple of Philae, dates to 394 CE. After that, the language of the pharaohs fell silent. The final chapter of ancient Egyptian religion closed in the 6th century, when Philae was shuttered under the reign of Justinian the Fair, a Christian Byzantine emperor. The priests who had kept Isis's flame alive for generations were gone. The statues remained, but the prayers had ceased. Yet even as temples emptied, Egypt's identity remained fiercely local. The Egyptian Christians, Copts, used the ancient language, written now in a Greek-based script. Their liturgy echoed old chants. Their theology, developed in Alexandria, fought vigorously for its independence. And when the rest of the Roman world embraced the Council of Chalcedon in 451 CE, the Copts refused. They were labelled heretics, but they stood their ground. Then, in 641 CE, a new wave arrived, not from Rome or Constantinople, but from Arabia. The forces of Islam, led by Amr ibn al-As, conquered Egypt. Byzantine forces fell back. A new era dawned. And yet, as had happened before, with Hyksos, Persians, Greeks, and Romans, Egypt adapted. The Nile kept rising. The cities endured. The bones of temples became the foundations of mosques. And even as Arabic replaced Coptic and the crescent replaced the cross, something deep in the culture persisted. Egypt never stopped being Egypt. It had become a province, a colony, a battlefield of empires, but never just a prize. Beneath every stone, behind every altar, and within every story whispered by the Nile, lived a memory of eternity. Even after the last temple fell silent and the hieroglyphs faded from stone, Egypt's voice was never truly lost. Across centuries and continents, echoes of the ancient land continued to ripple through religion, language, art, and myth. The pyramids may have been still, but the ideas that built them kept moving, subtle, persistent, eternal. The persistence of belief. No civilization in human history lasted as long as ancient Egypt's with such religious continuity. From the unification under Nama to the closing of the Temple of Philae, Egyptian religion survived for over 3,000 years, longer than most modern nations have existed. Its gods adapted, its myths deepened, and its rituals sustained not just a world view, but an entire social order. And even after the temples closed, Egypt's gods did not vanish. They evolved. The figure of Isis, once queen of heaven and sister wife of Osiris, became one of the most beloved deities in the Greco-Roman world. Her temples dotted the Mediterranean. Her cult reached Britain, Germany, and even the Black Sea. To many outside Egypt, she was the supreme goddess, a mother, healer, mourner, and queen. Later still, elements of Isis found their way into Christianity. Artistic depictions of the Virgin Mary nursing the infant Jesus resemble earlier statues of Isis suckling Horus. This isn't coincidence, it's cultural continuity. Egypt's maternal archetype passed into the heart of Christian iconography, carrying with it the emotional language of divine compassion. Other Egyptian symbols endured too. The Ankh, once a sign of life and vitality, became a talisman across faiths and ages. The scarab, a symbol of rebirth, continued as an amulet long after its meaning was forgotten. The Eye of Horus still protects against evil in jewelry shops from Cairo to California. The death and rebirth of hieroglyphs. For centuries after Egypt fell under Roman and Byzantine rule, its native script, hieroglyphs, remained a mystery. As Christianity spread, the language of the temples became viewed as pagan and obsolete. By the 5th century CE, the ability to read hieroglyphs had effectively vanished. The last known inscription, found at Philae, was carved in 394 CE. It reads simply, "Before the gods, may he live forever." And then, silence. Medieval writers saw hieroglyphs not as language, but as magical symbols. Alchemists, mystics, and secret societies claimed they held divine truths. They were studied not for grammar, but for hidden wisdom. For over 1,000 years, no one knew how to read the language of the pharaohs. That changed in 1799, when a French officer in Napoleon's army discovered a black basalt slab near Rosetta, a Nile Delta town. The Rosetta Stone, as it came to be called, bore a decree in 3 scripts: Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic. It was the key, but the lock had to be picked carefully. For years, scholars struggled. Then, in 1822, a young Frenchman named Jean-François Champollion cracked the code. Using his knowledge of Coptic, the later stage of the Egyptian language, he matched phonetic hieroglyphs to Greek names and began to unravel the system. With his breakthrough, a world opened. Suddenly, the walls of temples, tombs, and stelae spoke again. The pyramid texts whispered ancient spells. The kings of the new kingdom announced their conquests. Scribes recorded laws, taxes, love songs, and family squabbles. Egypt had a voice again, and what it said was profound. A civilization rediscovered. Throughout the 19th century, Egyptomania swept Europe. Obelisks were hauled to Paris and London, sphinxes graced royal gardens, and scarabs appeared on pocket watches and perfume bottles. Napoleon's invasion may have failed politically, but it sparked a wave of fascination with ancient Egypt that touched every corner of Western culture. Museums filled with mummies and statuary. Scholars raced to map temples, translate papyri, and reconstruct Egypt's ancient timeline. The colossal statues at Karnak, the towering pylons of Luxor, the valley tombs of Thebes. Each discovery brought a gasp, each artifact a mystery. And then, in 1922, the world held its breath. Howard Carter, a British archaeologist, uncovered a staircase in the Valley of the Kings. Beneath the sand lay the sealed tomb of Tutankhamun, a minor boy king who had died young. Inside were over 5,000 objects, solid gold coffins, ceremonial daggers, jeweled sandals, and the now iconic golden death mask. The tomb was untouched, a miracle. In a world devastated by war and political upheaval, Tutankhamun's tomb became a symbol of enduring beauty, a time capsule of golden eternity. The public was enthralled. Newspapers called it the discovery of the century. Rumors of a curse on the tomb captured imaginations, especially after the sudden death of Carter's patron, Lord Carnarvon. Truth or myth, the tale stuck. The mummy's curse became part of pop culture, further embedding Egypt in the modern mind. Egypt in art, science, and imagination. Ancient Egypt's influence extends beyond archaeology. Its mathematics and architecture influenced early Greek science. Its medicine, documented in texts like the Ebers Papyrus, prescribed surgical treatments, fertility practices, and anatomical knowledge millennia before Hippocrates. In modern art and literature, Egypt has served as both muse and mirror, from the operatic grandeur of Aida to Hollywood epics like The Ten Commandments and The Mummy. Its visual language, columns, coal-lined eyes, linen and lapis, instantly conjures a sense of wonder. Writers have returned to Egypt again and again. Agatha Christie set murder mysteries along the Nile. Naguib Mahfouz, Egypt's Nobel laureate, used pharaonic stories to explore modern dilemmas. Even science fiction, from Stargate to Assassin's Creed, reimagines Egypt as a timeless mystery, its ruins alive with forgotten power. What is it about Egypt that captivates? Perhaps it's the scale, pyramids built to last forever. Perhaps it's the mystery, a society that left so much written and yet so much unsaid. Or perhaps it's the idea that a people could stare into death, not with fear, but with resolve, and build eternity into the sand, a living legacy. Today, Egypt is a nation of over 100 million people, majority Muslim, speaking Arabic. But the imprint of its past is everywhere. The Coptic Church, still active, preserves the Egyptian language in its liturgy, a tongue that stretches back to the time of the pyramids. Farmers along the Nile still track the inundation season, just as their ancestors did 5,000 years ago. The names of ancient cities, Luxor, Aswan, Giza, still hold power. The pyramids still cast their shadows across the desert, reminding every passerby that something extraordinary once happened here. In museums, universities, and popular culture, Egypt's ancient wisdom remains a source of fascination. Its gods, symbols, and myths are part of a shared global imagination. Few civilizations can claim such reach. Fewer still can claim such survival. There are civilizations that lived and died in a flash, kingdoms that blazed briefly then vanished into myth. Egypt was not one of them. It was not a passing flame, but a slow burning fire. Its reign stretched so far across time that it becomes almost incomprehensible. From the unification of the two lands under Narmer to the conquest by Alexander, from the first carved hieroglyph to the final chant at Philae, Egypt stood for over 30 centuries. That's more time than separates us from Julius Caesar. The builders of the Great Pyramid were as ancient to Cleopatra as she is to us. What made Egypt so eternal? The answer begins with the Nile. This steady, annual gift of water and silt anchored the people to the land. It provided not just food, but rhythm. The flood, sowing, and harvest became the heartbeat of society. The Nile gave stability in an unstable world, and Egypt, in turn, came to see the world itself as something that could and must be kept in balance. That principle of ma'at, order, truth, justice, became the core of the Egyptian worldview. It wasn't just a religious ideal. It was how the cosmos worked. The pharaoh maintained it by ruling wisely. Judges upheld it in law. Families honored it by treating one another fairly. The battle against chaos wasn't abstract. It was a daily duty. And the Egyptians believed that even in death, this balance must be weighed, quite literally, against the feather of truth. Their view of life and death was not fearful, but practical. Death was not an end but a transition, a journey to another form of existence. This belief infused every tomb, every offering, every mummified body with purpose. To be forgotten was the true death. To be remembered, by name, by ritual, by stone, was to live forever. And so they built the pyramids, the mastabas, the painted tombs of the Valley of the Kings, the hieroglyph-covered temples at Karnak, Luxor, Abydos, Edfu, and Philae. These were not vanity projects. They were sacred contracts with time. Egypt wanted to be seen, known, and remembered. The architecture of eternity was its answer. But more than stone, it was the people who made Egypt endure. The scribes, who trained for years to master the hundreds of signs that filled every wall. The artisans, who painted the same scenes of the afterlife over and over with exquisite detail. The farmers, who measured their lives by the river's rise and fall, paying their taxes in grain, worshipping gods in family shrines. The priests, who woke temples with incense and chants each dawn. The queens and mothers, who shaped dynasties from behind the curtain of history. Even in the later periods, when foreigners ruled from distant capitals, It was Egyptians who kept the culture alive. Nubians and Libyans may have worn the crown. Greeks may have built Alexandria. Romans may have taxed the Nile. But it was the Egyptian worldview that continued to define life along the river. Continuity is perhaps Egypt's greatest triumph. In a world of upheaval, Egypt created something rare, a civilization that believed deeply in itself. Dynasties rose and fell. Gods were added and adapted, but the core remained: reverence for order, for death and resurrection, for the interplay between the seen and unseen. Even when Christianity arrived and the temples were closed, the stories didn't vanish. They transformed. Isis became Mary. Horus became Jesus. The Nile gods slipped into sainthood. The old and the new existed side by side, reshaped but never erased. Then came Islam, and once again Egypt adapted, absorbing the new faith while keeping its unique identity. Mosques rose where temples once stood. The call to prayer echoed where chants to Ra had once filled the air. The Arabic language replaced Coptic in everyday use. But Egypt remained a land of memory. The ancient echoes never fully faded. Today, the past stands in plain view. At Giza, tourists walk beside stones older than Abraham. At Karnak, light and sound shows recount the prayers of Ramesses II. In museums across the world, the faces of Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and Tutankhamun continue to fascinate. Hieroglyphs are no longer silent. The voices of the dead, once buried under sand, now speak across oceans and centuries. In modern Cairo, Luxor, and Aswan, millions of Egyptians carry on traditions both ancient and evolving. Farmers still depend on the Nile. Craftsmen still use techniques that haven't changed in millennia. Pilgrims still visit the sacred tombs of saints, many in places once holy to Osiris or Hathor. The idea of Egypt has become more than a nation. It is a symbol of mystery, of eternity, of resilience. When we imagine civilizations that endure, we see pyramids against a desert sky, a pharaoh gazing out from stone, a scribe bent over his scroll. We see Egypt, and perhaps that is Egypt's final magic. It was never only about the past. It was always meant to outlast time. Its monuments were letters to the future. Its rituals, instructions for how to live. Its stories, warnings and wonders for every generation to come. The Egyptians did not just try to survive. They tried to be remembered, and they succeeded.